All right, welcome back, everyone. Before we get started on this new unit, I wanted to just briefly talk about the schedule for the rest of the term. So we just finished Unit 8. That's going to be the last of the material that's covered on the upcoming midterm. That midterm is Friday after spring break, so 2 weeks from today. And then this Unit 9 is going to be the last unit for which we have a lab to do. So there's going to be a lab for Unit 9. It's going to be due the week after that midterm. And then for the rest of the semester after that, you'll have more time to work on your final projects because we won't have any labs due. You might be able to cancel the last 1 or 2 lectures as well, depending on how we're doing with the material. And then the final project, just to say a few words about it. So I'm going to be giving you guys a data set that comes from some real world, something, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. And your objective, it's going to be a classification data set. So your objective is going to be to design a classifier for it. And there's going to be, group-based project, sort of. So in the sense that there's going to be 3-person groups, and the people in each group can choose to work together or not. If you don't want to work together, then essentially all you need to do is you do your independent parts of the project and you just merge your reports together at the end and submit a single report to Carmen. You will get graded individually on your components of the project in any case. Now, if you do want to work together, then you can work together. Generally speaking, you can think of the project as having 3 components. One would be linear method, linear classifier, which is going to include support vector machines, even though, it's linear. It's debatable whether it's really linear or not. But anyway, that's one component. Another component is neural network. And the third component is decision tree. So we haven't talked about trees yet. We'll talk about that soon. But basically, the most common way to do the project is have one person on a team do the linear part, another person do the neural network, the third person do a tree. Now, if you get along with your teammates, you can team up and 2 or 3 of you could work on those different portions of the project, in which case some parts of the grade would just be sort of split. But I do want you to tell me, I wrote this part of the report, or, in your report, you'll describe how the collaboration was done. So the deliverables would be your final report, PDF, the code for your project, submitted on GitHub just like the labs. And finally, there's going to be a competition part. So Kaggle is it's a website that hosts machine learning competitions, and you can have private competitions. So we will have a competition for the linear, another competition for the tree, another competition for neural network, just for this class. And so you guys will be competing against, your group will be competing against other groups. And I found that makes it a lot more fun and exciting, and it motivates people a lot. So that's what we'll do with Kaggle. And so your final grade will be a combination of how good your Kaggle score was relative to the other students, how good your final project report is in terms of explaining what you did, and then finally, how good of a design you came up with, just in terms of the engineering of it. So if you have a great design and you just don't explain it at all, that's not going to be, you're not going to get the highest score possible. If your design, isn't that great, but you do a really good job of explaining why you did things, that's of course a lot better than not explaining it. So there's really, 3 pieces to the final score, final grade on the project. Okay, any questions on anything I said so far? Schedule for the class? All right, so after Unit 9, there's going to be no labs, but we are going to have lectures, and there will be quizzes. And we'll talk about clustering and PCA and Gaussian mixture models, EM algorithm. That's what we'll talk about. Okay, great. No questions on anything? Oh, there are some questions. Okay.
So we have a lab on this unit?
Yeah, Unit 9 has a lab, exactly. Yes.
What do you mean by designing the project? Is there a lot of innovations that are involved in the process, or it's just like the lab which we only implement basic code?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, so let's just take an example of a neural network. So what I want you to do is show me that you have understood what I've tried to teach you in this class, and you've taken all those concepts, and then you've done a good design with them. So for example, when designing a neural network, there's many different choices to make, right? Are you investigating those different things? Are you making good choices when you do that? Like if you have, maybe you have like a learning rate to choose. You want to demonstrate with some sort of plot that over a grid of different learning rates, you evaluated the performance and this was the right performance. Like you're not looking at training error, because training error, as we know, is not as important as like cross-validation or some sort of validation, right? So like, and the grid should be constructed so that there's a clear bottom. So if you have a grid that looks like this and ends, it suggests, oh, actually there's a better point over here. Why didn't you test that point? But that's a common thing, like on a not well engineered project. Or like to have the final report having no plots at all, just saying like, I tried this parameter without any justification whatsoever, or I tried several parameters, but then not showing the performance for those parameters. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like making good design choices, because there's many choices. I'm more interested in the stuff I taught you. It is possible to innovate. It is possible to do things beyond what I discussed in the class. But what's more important is to show first that you can do what I taught you. So for example, if you say, I'm going to use some method that we didn't even talk about, let's say transformer, and you do this neural network design with a transformer, and let's say you get good performance. Well, that doesn't show what you learned in this class, right? It doesn't show you that you understood anything I said. So if you want to do that, that's fine, but you first have to show, okay, this is the best I could get with a regular neural network. And then I went beyond that and I designed a transformer that was even better than that. So now I have a lot of material on which to grade you. I can see, did you design that neural network well? Did you learn everything I taught you? And then you also went beyond that and did something that was, that worked even better. So that would be an example of innovating. But it could be a small innovation. It could be like, using some, activation function we didn't talk about, or maybe combining different things we learned in the class in unique ways. Okay, great. Any other questions? Yes?
As for the schedule, when will the next midterm be?
Oh, it's going to be Friday in 2 weeks. Yeah. Any other questions? Awesome. Oh, yeah, question.
So is the linear neural network and the network tree all the same database? All the same data set?
Yeah, right. Everyone works with the same data set. So, yeah, depending on the data set, it might be neural networks might be the best, or it might be that the certain of these trees are the best. Or it could be the support vector machine, if designed well, can also get essentially the same performance. It really depends on the data set. I guess we'll see for this one. Okay, great. Any questions? Okay, so we're going to start a new unit, sort of an extension of what we talked about in the last unit with two-layer neural networks. Now we're going to consider neural networks that are deep, meaning essentially they have more than 2 layers. But we'll also learn about convolutional neural networks and just a lot of other stuff in general. So we're going to first talk about data sets a bit, because data sets are an important part of this sort of deep network revolution. So when you look before this revolution that happened roughly in 2012, which I'll show you in a moment, before that point, and we're going to focus, in this unit, we're going to focus on image classification, where the goal is every image is labeled with a given class. So for example, in this data set, CIFAR10, there are 10 different classes. And so given an image, your goal is to figure out, which of these classes does it come from. So that's image classification. Or you could say image recognition. And so before this time, when you look at what was available, what people were using for research, basically you had relatively small data sets by today's standards. So for example, MNIST, which we've seen before, 70,000 examples, 10 classes, pretty small images. CIFAR10, which is still used quite a bit just as a small test case. Similar, 60,000 examples, 10 classes, 32 by 32 images, now color images. Or another one, Pascal VOC, 11,000 examples, 20 classes. And this data set has images of different sizes, but still they're not very big. And this is just an example of the CIFAR10. You can see the resolution is pretty poor, 32 by 32 is just barely enough, even for a human, to see what's happening in these images. Okay, so around that time, there was a project by a particular professor, Fei-Fei Li, who thought the key to really making progress is to having more data. And at the time, it was actually kind of I don't know if controversial is the right word. It was maybe it wasn't an obvious thing to do, because at the time, even these data sets were difficult to handle computationally. So the idea of making the data set much, much bigger, it wasn't a clear thing. It was a little bit strange, perhaps. But they correctly understood that this really is the key. We need a much bigger data set in order to really make progress. And so their goal for this ImageNet data set that they created was to map out the entire world of objects. And what they ended up coming up with was a data set with 14 million images, almost 22,000 classes. And these classes are actually arranged hierarchically. They're sort of a tree. And that idea was based on an earlier data set of language called WordNet. And so it's not super hard to find millions of images, even back then, on the internet. But what is much harder is that the images you find are not labeled. You don't necessarily know what's in them. And so, and on an academic research budget, you don't have a huge amount of money to do all this labeling of millions of images. So very cleverly, they used a service at Amazon called Mechanical Turk, where you can farm out simple tasks for humans around the world to do. Things you can click on with a mouse, and every time a human does it, they get a few cents, basically. And they were, through that system, they were able to classify all these images without huge cost budget. So the details are in some papers and this really nice article. But these are just some sort of examples of what you have at different levels of the hierarchy. of mammals, and then within mammals there's different kinds, including placental mammals, different kinds of those, including carnivores, and so on and so on. And these images are 224 by 224, so they're a lot bigger, a lot more detailed. And so in addition to making this data set, they started a competition that ran for 8 years. And within that, within that competition, every year they had several challenges or sub-competitions. So for example, in 2012, there were 3. There was classification given 1,000 classes. The method would list the 5 most likely guesses of the class per image. And then you would basically be scored. One way to do the scoring is if the correct class is in your top 5, that's counted as correct. Another competition they had that year was a fine-grained classification class where there's basically 120 classes of different dog breeds. So getting, difficult in the sense that it's even difficult for humans maybe to determine the difference between these different dog breeds. And then they had another contest classification with localization where in addition to listing the 5 most likely guesses of the class, you had to also provide a bounding box. So for example, if you guessed maybe that this image was cherry, then you would want some sort of bounding box showing where in the image you think that label comes from. And then of course, in this case, the ground truth must also have the bounding box label. And then there's different ways to compare how closely the bounding boxes match. So this is a pretty challenging, these are all pretty challenging because when you look at any real image, you can see that there's a lot going on. So this image happened to be labeled as motor scooter, but you can see there's actually a lot of other things in the image. There's cars, there's people, there's a license plate, there's some signs and so on. And or in this one, there's not as much going on, but the thing that you're looking for is off center. And you never know the scale of the object. It could be a big thing or a small thing. It could be rotated different ways. So this is a challenging problem. It's much more challenging than the MNIST example that we saw earlier. Okay. So when you look at what happened over the years, so in 2010, this is before people entered any neural networks. They were just using traditional computer vision methods, things like, maybe support vector machines. You can see that, there's sort of a range of performances, capping out, 75% at best. And then over the years, you can see the worst ones are getting better, and the best ones are getting just slightly better, but they're sort of reaching sort of a ceiling that they can't really seem to go beyond. But starting in 2012, that is the first year that there was deep neural networks entered, and you can see it had a huge leap in performance, especially if you measure in terms of the error rate. Basically, second place, 25%, first place, 15%. So it's almost twice as good in terms of the error rate. So that was a massive jump in performance. And then you can see that this just kept going over the following years. The error rate just kept getting closer and closer to 0. And pretty soon, all the methods were deep learning. There was no more of these other methods in the contests. Okay, so this is sort of why a lot of people say that 2012 is sort of the start of this this latest stage or phase of artificial intelligence. And so at the same time also the same year that you had this big advance in image recognition, there was a similar one with speech recognition the same year. And then in the subsequent years, people started applying these techniques to many other problems in engineering, health, business, so on. And then you started to see this happen in many different tasks. Deep networks were making a big impact. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, so if we look at that first network from 2012, known as AlexNet, I'm not going to get into all the details now, but just a few kind of high-level things. So their goal at the time was to build a very deep network. So for us now, this is not a very deep network, but for them at the time, this was much deeper than what had been tried before. And the way they did this is they used 5 convolutional layers, which we'll talk about, and then 3 fully connected layers. The fully connected layers are exactly the MLP that we talked about in the last unit. So this is sort of like a 3-layer MLP, but then there's a bunch of these other stages that also have linear, nonlinear, linear, but the linear stages have more structure than just a matrix, just a plain matrix multiply. They're more efficient in some sense that we'll get into. And as you expect, if you're doing classification with 1,000 classes, then the very last layer is going to be a matrix, with 1,000 outputs. They had to also introduce several tricks that were new at the time that are now very common. Things like ReLU, activation, max pooling, dropout. We'll talk about all that stuff. And at the time, this had a lot of parameters. So 60 million different learnable parameters, 650,000 hidden nodes, neurons, also called feature maps. So so it was a lot. So even just in terms of computationally how they did it, they had to invent a lot of new strategies just to train this at the time. Now it's very easy, but then they had to do everything from scratch. Okay, so we'll get into how to interpret this diagram and everything in a little bit. We're first going to talk a little bit about, just generally speaking, what you get when you get more depth in your network. So, because we talked about 2-layer networks, so let's just review what we saw in 2-layer networks. So this picture comes from a package called TensorBoard, or in PyTorch it's called TensorBoard X. And that package does something very similar to the demo that we built in the last unit. And so what you can see that it does is it basically constructs this output picture like we did. And it also constructs these little pictures of what is happening at the different hidden nodes. And this is, in this case, for a 2-input system. So basically, if this is like x1 and x2 would give us the values of the two, we basically have 2-dimensional raw input features. And if you want to visualize how any particular, if you have a particular value here, how does it map to what's happening in that neuron? We generated these pictures last time. So we know that what's happening from here to here, we can think of as like a linear classifier. And so this shows you the classification boundary, and this would be the soft output. So you have values like 1 in this region and 0 in this region would be white. And so we have here, just like in our demo from the last unit, we have 4 of these linear classifiers, and we use these as transformed features for a second stage linear classifier that takes those 4 features and produces a single output that is also a soft output, a number, basically a number between 0 and 1. So that's what's shown here. And just like in our demo, you can see it's it's learning a pretty good classification boundary for this data set that is not linearly separable. But the nice thing about this is it's, it sort of writes that code for you. It just allows you to play around with things. So this is what we saw already in the last unit. So our question now is, if I have, not a data set like this, but a data set that's like this, what can I do to classify this? This is called the Swiss roll. You have one class are these points here, the other class are the blue. And so the decision boundary that you would need is kind of complicated for this data set. So can we learn this? And the answer is yes. Basically, you can use the same idea, but instead of stopping at 2 layers, you just go a few more layers. So here we have, I guess you could say maybe this is a 4-layer system in total. And when you look at what's happening here, this is like a linear classifier, so these pictures all look like the same ones we saw before. And then even in the second stage, you can recognize something. A couple of them are very similar to the one from the couple pages ago. And so essentially, like what the two-layer stuff we did was kind of like this. But now we're taking a bunch of those 2-layer networks, you could say, and using their outputs as hidden features for another layer, and then those outputs as hidden features for yet another layer. And then at the end of the day, you can get a pretty sophisticated decision boundary. It really does work to classify this. And you can see how what's happening just grows. It starts really simple, simple regions, more complex, even more complex, and even more complex. So as you add these additional layers, what you see happening gets more and more complex as you go through your network. Okay, any questions on what we have here? Okay, so that's what depth allows, is it just allows us to sort of hierarchically build simple features, use them for more complicated, and so on. And with enough layers, we can start to do some real-world classification tasks. Maybe this is a binary classification given a picture of a plant, to classify whether it's a weed or a crop, just as an example. Okay, so once again, you can make connections to biology. So you can, if you look at the human or mammalian brain, you also find that for the visual system, that it is organized into almost like layers that have actually been named by people that study this. Like V1 is the part of the brain that's directly connected to the optical nerves, and then those neurons are connected to V2 and V4 and so on. And as you go down these different stages of the brain, the representations you have get more and more complex. So if you look at what happens, what the neurons directly connected to the optical nerve are doing, they're just sensing some very basic patterns that your eyes might be seeing, like edges, checkerboards, very basic stuff. And then those neurons, their outputs are combined to another layer of neurons that is synthesizing them and looking at slightly more complicated structures and so on, until obviously as humans we can perceive very complicated structures in the end. So there's really kind of an analogy behind what's happening in these deep neural networks and what's happening in the mammalian brain. Okay, a little bit of history. So first deep network was in the 60s, first convolutional deep network in the 80s. Backpropagation was also something that was studied in the 80s. But as we know, in those early days, there were a lot of challenges. They didn't have much training data. So if you don't have much training data and you try to train a lot of parameters, you can get overfitting. Limited computational power. And a problem, the vanishing gradient problem, which something we can discuss now. So when we learned about backpropagation, we learned that the gradients propagate backwards through your neural network over various layers, right? And if you think about what happens when you go through a sigmoid activation, so this is maybe a sigmoid, and you think about what is the gradient. Actually, I didn't draw this very well. Let me try to do a better job. Okay, so when you think what is the gradient of a sigmoid, because that's important when we do backpropagation, right? The gradient of that sigmoid is directly multiplied by the gradients we've seen before it. And so when you look at a sigmoid, at least when it's not scaled at all, the slope at the origin is 1. And as you get away from the origin, the slope goes to 0 on both sides. Okay, so that means if you backpropagate through a sigmoid, if your output happens to be right at the origin, it doesn't change in magnitude. But anytime your output is away from the origin, the magnitude of the gradient decreases. And the farther you are away from the origin, the more it decreases. Now, if you imagine going through several of these sigmoids, it's like it decreases again, it decreases again. And by the time you get towards the front of your network, there's no more gradients. They're tiny. So that means that you can't really adjust the parameters at the beginning of your network. And so this is called the vanishing gradient problem. And this was something that people didn't really know about or didn't understand, maybe back in these days. But it was one of the things that this ReLU activation solves because it looks like this. For any positive input, the gradient is always 1, so it doesn't decay at all. So basically, that is one of the ways to deal. Basically, the main way that they solve this vanishing gradient problem. There's some new problems it causes we'll talk about later, but it largely solved this problem. Okay, and then there's other things too, like if you look at just MLPs and what happens if you get a deep MLP, you have a lot of computational issues because there can be a lot of parameters to learn. So this was solved by convolutional layers and pooling layers. And there's a lot of other tricks that were introduced that just make everything work better. So these are all the things in modern deep networks that they didn't have in the early days. We'll get into all the details soon. Okay, so what we're going to start with is we're going to start learning about convolution because it's one of the big important ingredients. So the idea, as I mentioned before, is that in an early layer of a network, essentially you're trying to look for very simple patterns within the image, and those are building blocks that are used for later stages. So examples of those patterns, there could be like line segments or edges or curves or bumps, things like that. And so those little building blocks, those can be then combined, into more sophisticated shapes, and then those can be combined into yet more sophisticated shapes. So basically what you want to do, let's say at the beginning, is you want to search for these simple patterns, maybe like these little bumps or things like that. And the thing about these patterns is they can be anywhere in the image. It's not like that it's going to be in the middle or on the edge. It can be anywhere. So basically you want some strategy for looking for patterns that works everywhere, that is translation invariant, and that is something that we get with convolution. And so to understand convolution, basically you could say it's just a simple way of doing pattern matching. So it goes kind of like this. Imagine that I have this image, which has all these different digits located in different portions of the image. And let's say I want to find a 4. So a real simple thing to do would be to make a little small template image of a 4 and slide that template around to different locations in my larger image and do an inner product which we know if you have two matrices, the inner product is just a pointwise multiply of all the terms and summing up. And so like visually, it just means, you would compute the, you would take your template and you just do a pointwise multiply of those pixels and the ones below it in the image and sum it up. And you can sort of visually see that if this template is sitting right on top of this 4, even though it's not exactly the same 4, but it's pretty close, you'll get a lot of, you get a large inner product, right? You'll get a lot of, well, much larger than if you did the inner product with the 4, over here. You're not really going to get much out of that. So essentially this whole idea of convolution is really just a simple way of searching for patterns. So you take this template and you just shift it to all locations of your image, and you just basically systematically look to see how much of a match is that pattern at that location. And you store the results of all those inner products in a new image. And basically this is saying, like, if there's a 4 or whatever matches your template here, that at that location of your output image, you should see a large value. Whereas at this location over here, you should see a pretty small value. So that's the idea. And if you want to see the details, is basically, this is the equation. So W is what we call the kernel, or our template. It's the same thing. And so this is going to have, maybe we're using K1 and K2 to index it. So maybe this is, K1 tells us how far we are vertically, K2 how far we are horizontally within that kernel. And then for the image X, J is the location where we have moved the template to. So that would be like this point would be J1 and J2. And then if you want to look over all those pixels, you need to add to J1 and J2, K1 and K2 for all the different places in your kernel, right? So it's like, this is J1 and J2, that's fixed if I'm looking at one particular output. And then I'm just basically I'm looking at all the locations for K1, K2, and summing the product of the template and the underlying image together. Okay, so basically that's the idea. Is that making sense? Okay, any questions on that? Because that's the main idea. If you understand that, then I think you understand just about everything. Good with that? Okay. All right. So now we just have to get into a few details about this and terminology and so on. So this operation that we've written down here, if you look in the digital signal processing literature, books, papers, and so on, this is called correlation. That's exactly this is a two-dimensional correlation. And if you want to implement this in Python, you'd probably go to the SciPy signal library, and they have the correlate to 2D function. And there's a related operation called convolution. And the only difference in convolution and correlation is that in convolution, there's some negative signs here. So the way that you can sort of interpret this, based on this picture over here, is that if this is your J1 and J2, rather than sort of putting your template down here, what you would do is you would flip your template both horizontally and vertically, and you'd have its sort of mirror image version up here. And that is what convolution would compute. And so you can see it's really very similar. If you just pre-flipped your template, then it kind of negates the effect of this sign change. And so it's sort of like just almost a matter of definition. Do you want your template to be flipped or unflipped? And for the purposes of looking for patterns, because these templates are going to be things we learn, it doesn't really matter if we flip them or not. We're just going to learn the flipped version. So basically, there's two very similar things. And when you look at the neural network machine learning literature and they talk about convolution, basically they're talking about correlation. They're talking about you could also say, this is another sort of intermediate, is in the DSP literature, correlation is sometimes called convolution without flipping reversal, whereas what they call convolution, you could say is convolution with flipping and reversal. So when you go to the neural network packages then, they just omit the negative sign, they focus on this, and they call it convolution. But if you wanted to implement that with SciPy signal, you would need to use correlate 2D, not convolve 2D. So it's really just a matter of terminology. And this is maybe slightly simpler to implement, so it's just, let's go with the simpler option. Okay.
So when your phone is reading text from an image, it's computing that in seconds.
So this is, so what we do in neural networks is we're going to compute this. Exactly. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Okay, so now we have to talk about some details which have to do with how we handle the boundary of the image. So there's basically 3 different modes that people talk about, 3 different options for handling the boundary. And so in these pictures, the dark part would be the kernel. This is the input, the light blue is the input image. And then this would be the output image, the result of doing that correlation or convolution. So in the so-called valid mode, essentially you move your kernel around to all the positions in your image, but you never allow the edges of your kernel to escape your image. So for example, if we have this 4x4 image and a 3x3 kernel, there's only 4 places we can move that kernel to. It's either here, next to it to the right, or here, right? So as a result, the output image has only 4 pixels. Another option, the one that you'll see like in most signal processing books or classes when they talk about convolution, is you allow the kernel to kind of maximally escape, but it still has to be touching the original image. So in this case, you could move this kernel around to all these positions, and this would be the dimensions of the output image. And in fact, the output image has more pixels than the input image. And then there's this in between where you allow it to escape just enough that the input and output images have the same dimension. So the larger your kernel gets, the larger of a boundary you would need to include. Okay, so these are the 3 options. Probably the most common one people use in neural networks would be this one, just because it just keeps the size of the image just stays the same. It's sort of, you don't have to worry about the image constantly changing sizes when you go through these layers. But there are going to be some visual implications of whether you do this or this or this. Because essentially, what you're doing here when you allow it to go outside is you're implicitly assuming that there are pixels there that have 0 value. In other words, black. 0 is usually the darkest it can be. So, so as we'll see, that has an effect on what the image looks like once you do this convolution. All right. Any questions on the types of padding? These are the padding modes, I guess. Okay. Yes?
So what would be the benefits of using padding?
So if you don't use any padding, what happens is every time you do convolution, your image shrinks in size. So if you do convolution several times, like every deep layer, your image is just going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. So that's one issue. Also, the sizes of the images themselves are going to get maybe kind of strange. Like often when you build something in hardware, it's nice to have sizes of things be powers of 2 for memory. And if you start to get weird prime numbers and all that, it's just not a very efficient use of hardware. So those are sort of the issues you might find if you, and also as you change the size of the kernel, then that actually changes the size of the image. So those are, those are maybe what's not so convenient about this. All right. Good. Any other questions? Okay. So yeah, and these are just examples, numerical examples with numbers, but I think you get the idea. So let's take a look at visually what happens with these different paddings and different kernels. So here we're going to be using the SciPy signal and skimage libraries, and we're going to be using this famous cameraman image. And we'll look at a couple different applications or kinds of convolution. Local averaging or blurring, which is a way of reducing noise, and also kernels meant to do edge detection. Okay, so let's first look at a kernel that is uniform. So we're going to make a 9x9 kernel, and you can see when we construct it, it's just a matrix of ones, but then divided by the size of the number of pixels. So basically, if you sum up all the pixels in this kernel, it equals 1. So essentially what it does as you slide it around is it just does a local average. So for example, this is the original image top left. So as I slide my 9x9 kernel around, it's just doing a local average of the pixels there. And then it is basically, whatever that average is, it's storing it here. And then you move it to the right a little bit, another local average, and it stores it next to it and so on. So that's what we see here. This is uniform kernel, as we said on this page. And now we're going to look at the different padding modes. So we have full padding, same padding, and valid padding. Okay, so when we do valid padding, as we know, the kernel never escapes the image. And so it's really just averaging these gray sky pixels here. And so you essentially, you get gray at the boundaries. And if you zoom in, so what we're doing is we're just zooming into the top left corner. This is what the original image looks like over the 20 by 20 pixels. You can see that the sky is a little bit noisy, a little bit random. But after you do this sliding around this kernel, it basically smooths everything out because it's just taking the local average of like this, and then it's moving it over 1 pixel, taking the local average of that. And as you move this, not really much is changing. You're using almost all the same pixels, and so as you move from pixel to pixel here, not really much is changing. So this is, you can see it is removing the so-called noise in that image and just making it nice and smooth. So that's why you might want to use such a kernel. I mean, there's much better ways to do it, but this is just a simple way of removing noise. Of course, there's an artifact that we don't like, which is it's blurring the details too. Okay, now let's look at the different kernels. So that's valid mode. Now we said if we do, let's say, full mode, that's essentially assuming that there's a 9x9 or 8x8 boundary of black around the entire image that we're going to use for our convolution. And as a result, you can see that you get sort of a black boundary here in your convolved output. And if you zoom in, you can see that the degree of blackness as you get to the edge, because that the very corner pixel, there was 1 gray pixel and then 80 pure black pixels, and that gave you basically this color here. It's almost purely black. Maybe not perfectly, but very close. And as you get more in here, your kernel saw fewer and fewer black pixels, and eventually, at this point, it was all sky pixels, all gray pixels. So this is, and then same mode is going to be in between. For a 9x9 kernel, you're going to have a boundary of 4, so that's why there's 4 of these edge rows that look a little different than the sky. And here are the shapes of the images that come out. You can see, same mode is the same as the input, but then the other ones are either smaller or larger than the input image.
If we use the same over and over again, would it be like the boundary will eat in?
Yeah, basically, It will to some effect, yes. Yeah.
But there's no actually black in the original image.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So, so as it turns out, like the way we'll see that the way that these networks are constructed is typically after you do one of these processing stages, you're actually going to subsample the image. You're going to make it smaller, and so you're going to essentially like remove some of those rows, and so they're not going to be as big of a problem. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, great. Any other questions? Okay. All right, so we can also look at the effect of the kernel size. So, 9 by 9 or 15 by 15. These are still uniform kernels. And you can see what happens is a 15 by 15 is just going to do a lot more blurring because it's a larger template that's moving around. So as you move it 1 pixel to the right, there's just even less change than with a 9 by 9. Most of the larger fraction of pixels are staying the same, so you get more of this blurring behavior. And you can also look at different types of kernels. So we looked at the uniform kernel previously. If you're doing blurring, a slightly more common one is the Gaussian blur kernel. So this is like a 2-dimensional Gaussian shape here. And so, because the kernel has pretty small values out here, it's not going to do as much blurring as a 9 by 9 uniform kernel. It's going to be a little bit more coherent. And you can also see, like with the uniform kernel, you're getting sort of like 2, so this is the original. The original image, the camera leg there's just 1 camera leg, and now with the uniform, you can see it's almost like there's 2. Whereas with the Gaussian, it's more of a smudge than a replication. So there's some different details you can see, different ways these kernels behave. But this one, as we'll see, is actually something that shows up when you train the deep neural networks like AlexNet, and you actually look at the kernels that are learned from the data, you will invariably see like this as one of those learned kernels, variations on this. So this is definitely a useful thing to have in your arsenal of kernels to process images and recognize simple patterns. You probably won't see the uniform one. Probably, yeah. I don't, but these you do see. Okay. Great. Any other questions? Okay. So we can also do interesting things with kernels that are not just bumps like that. So we can do edge detection if we build a kernel in the right way. So here, these are 3 by 3 kernels where you can see that there's zeros in the middle, positive on the left, and negative on the right. Or here we have one that's the same, but just the transpose. And so the idea here is that when you pass this through your image, it's going to look at changes from left to right. So if it notices that you have brighter pixels on the left and darker pixels on the right, you're going to get the output of this will be positive at that edge. And if it's the opposite, darker on the left, brighter on the right, you're going to get a negative output at that edge. And this is going to detect the same, but it's going to detect horizontal edges instead of vertical edges. And so, so here's an example of the original image, same image, and here we're constructing one of these kernels, and this is the kernel that is detecting vertical edges, and you can see it's doing quite a good job of detecting vertical edges. And so here, because it's going from light to dark, it's putting like a white edge there. But here, if you go from dark to light, you can see there's a dark edge. Meanwhile, like that's responding only to the vertical edges. This horizontal edge is really kind of invisible to that filter. But then you can also have the filter that's detecting horizontal edges. It sees that, but it is less. Yeah, the vertical edges are like, I guess maybe there's one there, not as pronounced. Okay, so this is just showing you that there's other kinds of shapes you can create, very simple shapes that are still very useful. And these these kind of shapes also are very important learned shapes in the early stages of these image neural networks. Okay, so that's a great time to stop. If you guys have any questions on anything, let me know. Otherwise, have a great spring break. I'll see you guys back here after spring break.